So fellas, if you're a fan of combat sports and you've been keeping up with social media recently, you might be aware that Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz are having a rematch, not in the UFC, not in BKFC, not even in Masvidal's bare knuckle MMA promotion. They're having a boxing match, and I just want to say that this might be one of the saddest build-ups to a boxing match I've ever seen. There is more life in a cardboard box than there is in this boxing match. It is honestly the most dead build-up, and the reason I'm exaggerating how dead it is because there was a time when these guys were the biggest stars in the UFC. Masvidal in 2019, when Masvidal fought Nate Diaz in 2019, that was the shit. These guys were on the top of the UFC, and now just a few years later, it just looks like you've got two drunk grandpas trying to fight for a paycheck on the middle of the street. There's no interest in this matchup whatsoever, and the overall build-up for this card and the event and whatever has been seriously poor. Nobody wanted to see this. Nobody was waiting for Masvidal to come out of retirement or Nate Diaz to, after his boxing match with Jake Paul, nobody was waiting for both of these guys to suddenly have a boxing match. There's genuinely, like, we've heard everything already. They've already fought in MMA. They've already had their press conferences in the UFC where they've trash talked. We've heard Nate Diaz mumbling. We've heard Masvidal threaten to break his orbital bone. We've seen it already. And the fact that there's not only been one, not two, not three, but there's been about 5 press conferences already for this event. Why has there been so many press conferences? That's something else I want to rant about. I know in boxing, it's normal to have at least like 2 or 3 press conferences, at least one in both of the hometowns of the fighters, but to have like, what, 4 or 5 of them already? I don't know why they've done so many press conferences, especially for the fact that we're in April. It's not even June. Like, this isn't even fight week. I can only imagine the amount they're going to do on fight week. We're probably going to have a total of like 8 press conferences. Why is there so much? It's just the same thing. Like, you can tell in like the last 2 press conferences, they were both just there because they had to be there. They had no interest. It got to the point where in the final press conference, Nate Diaz walked out of the press conference. Jorge Masvidal decided to beef with some random guy in the crowd. And that's the promotion. That's these guys are the 2 of the former biggest stars in the UFC, and that's their promotion for this event. That just says everything you need to know about it, and it just feels like the event is a massive cash grab. I don't know who's funded this event and how they've been able to fund it, but it do not pay for this event. This is the biggest cash grab I've ever seen in the history of combat sports. Well, actually, I've seen a few bigger ones, but it's a big cash grab. I don't care about it at all. Both of them look terrible in their last few as well. Fair enough if they were both coming off at least 1 win. Both of these guys have looked terrible in their last few fights. Jorge Masvidal, first of all, has been on a big losing streak. Obviously got knocked out cold by Usman. Before that, he lost to a decision to Usman. Got beaten by Colby Covington, where, you know, that was actually a big, interesting fight. And then goes out there at UFC 287 against Gilbert Burns. Loses. He's been retired for over a year. He hasn't been involved in any combat sports. He's been looking obese in the pictures that I've been seeing in him. And now he's coming back to fight Nate Diaz, who's looked terrible in his last few. I know he beat Tony Ferguson, but he looked terrible in that fight. That was a boring fight, and plus it's Tony Ferguson. Then he goes out there, boxes Jake Paul. He had his moment with the guillotine, which was, you know, fair enough. That was quite fun, but still lost to Jake Paul. And they've both just looked terrible in their last few. It's not like they're coming off great performances. It's just you've got a big name versus a big name, and that's what you're selling, and that's what they're trying to sell to you lot. Fair enough, right? I know I said this at the beginning. Fair enough if this was bare knuckle MMA. I know Masvidal does like a bare knuckle MMA promotion. I don't know how he's got away with that, but fair enough if it was bare knuckle MMA. I wouldn't mind seeing Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal in an MMA fight if it was bare knuckle, because at least you've got the 2 former BMFs in a bloody fight. If not MMA, BKFC. I'm pretty sure if you told BKFC, listen, I want to fund Masvidal versus Diaz, I think BKFC would be on par with that. A bare knuckle boxing match between 2 of the former BMFs, even if it was just a simple rematch in MMA. I'm not even going to act like I'm that interested in a rematch in MMA at this point, because we've seen it before. I don't expect much from it again. I guess it's the only winnable fight for Masvidal nowadays, but even if it was a rematch in MMA, I'd be somewhat interested. But a bog standard boxing match, I just don't care. I've already ranted about the press conferences. There have been so many press conferences. You can just tell that Nate Diaz has got to the point where he knows that nobody cares, and he's just trying to make it to fight day to get the paycheck and leave. You can tell both of these guys kind of know right now that no one really cares. They just want to get paid. They're bored of the press conferences, and so are we. They've got Chris Avila versus Anthony Pettis, which I think is the core main event. You know what? That's actually not that bad of a fight. Chris Avila has kind of been floating around different boxing promotions, boxing different dudes. Not the highest caliber people, but he's been winning fights. So fair play to Chris Avila. And then Anthony Pettis, he's actually one of the more successful guys who's come from the UFC to box, and he's been on a bit of a streak recently. So you know what? I'm actually quite interested in that fight. I expect that to be a decent fight, but The main event, Masvidal versus Diaz, there's no interest in it. And they just should have done it in an MMA promotion. I'm sure there's at least one MMA promotion. And I think Masvidal's tied to the UFC, which is maybe why I couldn't do it. But I'm sure the UFC would be willing to put on Masvidal versus Diaz too with like a featured fight of a card. They're two big stars, which is why they're the main event of this card. I'm sure the UFC would have been able to do it, or at least BKFC for the BMF belt. But if Masvidal's still tied to the UFC and he's still signed to the UFC, at least do it in the UFC. Overall, I think this event is a massive cash grab. If you pay for this event, you know what, you deserve to get scammed out of your money. I don't know what you're expecting. My expectations for this fight is it's going to be Nate Diaz in the clinch, trying to get a big moment, probably just landing shots in the clinch. Jorge Masvidal just about landing the better shots on the feet. Neither of these guys are going to knock each other out. It's going to go to a decision. Jorge Masvidal is probably going to win the decision, call out Jake Paul. Jake Paul's going to beat Mike Tyson. They're going to do Jake Paul versus Masvidal. Boom. There, I've just leaked the script for you. There's no excitement in this matchup at all. It's not like we're both on the edge of our seats for this fight. There's no excitement in it. And like I said at the beginning, and I've said multiple times, it shouldn't be a boxing match. If you're going to get two of the biggest former, and, you know, I'm saying former in an explanation point here, former stars, two of the biggest former stars in the UFC, at least do it in an MMA fight, not a boxing match. You know what I mean? I've heard a lot of people as well. They've been talking about how good combat sports has been in June. They've been talking about UFC 302. They've been talking about UFC 303. They've been talking about the Hamzat Chimaev versus Robert Whittaker fight night that we're all excited for. And then a couple of you guys have been trying to slide in Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz too. No one cares about this matchup. It shouldn't be anywhere near those. It's just a cash grab between two big stars. It's not even going to be a fun fight. Like I said, if it was in like a BKFC, at least you can expect blood and violence. It's not going to be a fun fight. It's just two old men, former stars, coming to get their last paycheck of their career. And then after this, we're probably not going to hear from them until they get a fight with Jake Paul or somewhat ridiculous like that. So, Masvidal versus Nate Diaz 2. Overall, it's been an incredibly sad build-up. The press conferences have just got more and more lifeless as they've gone on. Even the promoter for the press conference don't care anymore. And overall, I just think it's a terrible event. If you pay for this event, to be completely honest with you, you kind of deserve to lose your money, because who is paying for this? I don't even know if it is pay-per-view. The ridiculous thing is as well, they've not even told us the start times for the event. Like, I know it's on the same day as UFC 302, which is one thing, because no one's picking this over UFC 302. I'd rather watch the early prelims of 302 than watch this fight alone. But if it's anywhere close to the same time as the actual active time of UFC 302, then I don't know who promoted this, because everyone's going to be watching 302. I assume it's going to be a couple hours early before the event starts. Maybe it'll be going on during the early prelims, but still, it's just a terrible event. It's just a cash grab. Do not pay for this. And the build-up is not even interesting. It's not even like we're getting good moments at the press conference. The build-up is just as dead. And yeah, that's my thoughts on Masvidal versus Nate Diaz 2. It's an incredibly sad build-up. And if you haven't heard from this, I don't blame you, because it's a terrible event. Let me know your thoughts on these guys boxing each other in a boxing match. And do you actually think it's a clown show? Because I do. Thank you for watching.